Thanks, Melissa. And I wonder, Michaela, if we can just start sharing the slides that we have. And it is a pleasure to be here, as I know that the community forests are one of the really important ways that we're building partnerships. And I think it's just a really great practical example of some of the things that we need to see advance in the province here as we all work towards this this major project of reconciliation. So what I'll do is sort of share a few thoughts. Melissa and I are going to kind of toss it back and forth a few times here, but I'm going to share a few thoughts kind of that maybe help describe in broad terms where the province is seeing its work with First Nations and Indigenous peoples as it looks to get towards kind of a nation-to-nation reconciliation space, and as it looks to advance nation-to-nation reconciliation dialogues. And this slide here is showing you sort of, what I'll call some of the sort of foundation, the framework approaches that, or statements or documents that have been approved or issued by the province in the last 3 or 4 years, and all of which sort of taken together represent a very substantial shift in approaches towards these government-to-government negotiations or reconciliation conversations. I think that the sort of 2017 mandate letters of this government, when this government was first formed, signaled a shift, which was supported pretty quickly by the endorsement of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and subsequent to that, by the draft 10 principles to guide the province of British Columbia's relationship with Indigenous peoples, which was a close kind of mirror to federal 10 principles that had been released 18 months prior to that. And those documents then laid the groundwork for, I think, one of the most important achievements of the previous government's mandate, which was the passing of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which required a number of things, including the consistency of laws of British Columbia with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, required an action plan to support that, required annual reporting, and provided for a really substantive shared decision-making approach in Section 7 of that document. So really fundamental kind of shift and statement in terms of rebalancing or repositioning the province's relationship with Indigenous peoples contained in that piece of legislation. That's now been followed up. 2020 mandate letters, which I'll speak about in a little bit, talked about transforming from short-term transactional arrangements to long-term partnership-based agreements. We had a really important reflection of all of this sort of new thinking and new foundation in a policy that was released in a tripartite way by the province, the federal government, and the First Nations Summit, called the Recognition and Reconciliation of Rights Policy in the BC Treaty Process, which reflected a bit of a transformation in how the province, I'll speak for the province here, is thinking about the treaty process and how it wants to be conducting itself in the context of treaty negotiations. And most recently, you've had the Declaration Act Action Plan, which is which has been released in draft. Everybody can go look at it, and final comments have just kind of come in. And we're looking at sort of taking those comments and working them all through to produce a final version. And the action plan represents a multi-year plan to actually take concrete steps that are going to not only align British Columbia's laws, but also our policies and practices consistent with the UN Declaration. So what the sort of takeaway from this slide is that in the last number of years, we've sort of seen this progression, this kind of upwards curve in terms of government's commitments in respect of reconciliation. So maybe, Michaela, we can shift to the next slide here. This is a bit of a repeat of what I kind of spoke about, but a little bit more detail in the Declaration Act. So sets out a process to align the province's laws with the UN Declaration. I didn't really focus on this, but it provides flexibility for the province to enter into agreements with a broader range of Indigenous governments. And that's important because for a long, long time, you know, we had this sort of practical constraint in respect of the groups that the province was able to work with. They had to be societies or some other legal entities, or they had to be an Indian Act entity prescribed by the sort of colonial era Indian Act, or of course a modern treaty nation that had settled a modern treaty, which is sort of the ultimate goal, but also one which few nations in the province have achieved to date. And there's many nations in the province who are looking for alternative pathways to kind of get to long-term reconciliation in the treaty process, and may not want the kind of outcome that the treaty process to date has prescribed. And so one of the ideas behind the Declaration Act, and this is Section 6 of the Declaration Act, is to set out a bit of a definition of Indigenous governing body that allows a nation to define, or the proper rights holding entity to kind of define how it chooses to be represented. So kind of a subtle and not really, that element of the Declaration Act didn't get a lot of attention, but a pretty fundamental shift in sort of the province stepping back and not prescribing who it enters into agreements with, but really enabling Indigenous peoples to determine who represents them. I spoke a little bit about the framework for decision-making between Indigenous governance and the province. So that's frameworks that enable either joint.
Thanks, Tom. That's a great overview, and we'll go back to you shortly. So I just wanted to sort of deep dive more into the draft action plan. So just to be clear, this is a piece of work that has gone on. It's cross-government. It's a cross-government initiative. Every ministry has a role to play in reconciliation. And so some of the pieces, though, forestry and land use management feature heavily in not just in the action plan, but in the conversations that we have with Indigenous nations across the province. We have regional staff talking to nations. We have people like myself and Tom. And so the picture is really being painted that, you know, these two actions in here on co-development and enhancement of strategic level policies, programs, initiatives, reflecting collaboration and cooperation, which is a key part of the Declaration Act, on stewardship of the environment, land, and resources is critical. And we're going to get into FERPA a little bit later, so we'll expand on this piece. And the other item is to reform forest policy in consultation with First Nations. And I'm going to step into that. Before I do, Susan and I were talking before this session, and we were talking about fuel management. I've heard you had a good presentation for the wildfire folks here. And another piece that's not on this slide, and it's too bad it's not, is around moving forward on engagement with prescribed and cultural burning. And when I was up in the interior this past summer, this became a critical issue that we heard about. And I know community forests are also quite interested in this. So just a little flag there. But back to reforming forest policy in consultation with First Nations. This is what I think you've been hearing about today. I know my colleague, Sarah Fraser, spoke about the Modernizing Forest Policy Initiative of government, and it really ties into this. So a lot of what we are doing with the modernization of forest policy has been directly influenced by what we have heard since around 2017 in our engagements with First Nations, to the First Nations Forest Strategy, to the Interior Forest Sector Renewal, and so that's why it features so heavily in the draft action plan. Next slide, Tom.
Great. Okay, thank you. So what this slide is trying to show is some of the major sort of themes. So with the background and the kind of context that we shared around how this government has sort of brought in important documents or positions or policies that have looked to change the nature of our relationships with Indigenous nations, we've seen a number of kind of broad themes emerge. And we've tried to describe some of these here, and I want to kind of speak to each of them because I think this is sort of starting to reflect how these relationships are starting to evolve. And I think generally the bullets on this slide are reflecting as well things that our nations that we negotiate with, that we engage with, have been looking for some time. So the first one is co-development of mandates. There's a whole multi-hour presentation we can get into on sort of how you might co-develop mandates. But the basic principle here is that rather than be presented with a question or a problem as government and work with government within government to put a policy approach together which prescribes how we're going to respond to this problem, what we're going to do is try and share the problem. We're going to try and be bringing the issue and sitting down with our partners and talking about, well, what are some approaches that might resolve this? And we're going to do that much closer to the front end of a conversation, which allows us to understand the perspectives that First Nations are bringing to the particular question or challenge that we're looking for. It also lets us be much more open with other groups, whether it's local government or industry, talking through here's a problem that we're working with to try to resolve. And so that when we go into cabinet to look for a decision on a particular agreement or on a particular approach, we have much a great understanding, often greater support for the proposal, but at the very least, a much greater understanding of the perspectives and reaction of everybody who that decision is going to impact. And the idea, I think, Brian, you need to put yourself. Just making sure I don't have an echo here. Thanks, Brian. So the idea is that we're trying to kind of work through what the proposal is and develop that together as we go into cabinet. It doesn't mean that we're all going to agree on ultimately what the proposal is, and it also, government. There are many cases and many occasions where government has to kind of make a decision, taking into account a whole variety of factors, and but it at least means that we're really developing with First Nations the request that goes into cabinet. The next one, in terms of a starting point for approaches to reconciliation, is recognition of and implementation of rights and titles. So that sounds like it's almost like that's said so much that it sort of becomes meaningless, but it actually is very meaningful. It's shifting the beginning of the narrative from a place of proof, from a place of requiring evidence, whether it's of an Indigenous people's occupation of an area or that Indigenous peoples have a right over an area, sometimes requiring a court decision, to a place where we're looking to start a conversation on the basis of, we're going to begin this conversation with the assumption of recognition, and we're going to see where that, when we start from that conversation, where does that kind of get us? Meaning the conversation shifts from conversation around proof to a conversation around how do we work together to accomplish our mutual goals or our shared interests, and understanding that in itself represents a really big shift in how the province has worked previously. Emphasis on long-term partnership over short-term transaction-based engagement, which means that we're looking to build relationships and build sustainable relationships over a period of time, that we're not just focused on the decision that's in front of us at this moment. That creates, can create some challenges. But it's important, so important as a principle, that I think we've done some things as a government where we've really been focused on the long-term partnership that has which has changed how we might make decisions around short-term elements. And I think ultimately this is kind of a good sort of focus in terms of building relationships in the future. Emphasis on the social sector alongside natural resources. So this is sort of partners with the previous piece around long-term partnership, but it's really about looking at how we support communities to support their members as well, in addition to sort of being more strictly focused on land management. Sharing in the decision-making and the economic benefits is, I think, probably self-explanatory. I've talked a little bit about that. The point that I think I'll make here, though, is that these are not two mutually exclusive things. I think sharing in the decision-making with First Nations needs to be partnered with sharing in the economic benefits. Because if you're just sharing in the decision-making, but you're not sharing in the economic benefits, you're not really creating a good environment, a good arena for collaboration or for decision-making based on the same interests and principles. Or you're not making a decision environment that has everybody reflecting on the balance of interests and how we achieve that balance of interests together. And so it is important that we're thinking about those things together. Governance development is important. I mean, we're quite focused on making sure that on sort of wanting to support governance development in nations and having proper rights holders properly represent themselves, and that also kind of invokes or brings into play a very significant overlap conversation in the province, which is something that is really challenging, and we struggle with constantly, and is it's one of those shared problems that we continue to tackle. And then an incremental approach to reconciliation, which really means we're not trying to kind of negotiate and then get everything done all at once. If that's where nations want to be, we're happy to accommodate that. But what we found is that nations are saying, can we negotiate something now, deliver some benefits now, start to build our relationship and share accountabilities, and then move to the kind of next piece along the way. So those are some important themes and principles for us that I wanted to share. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Some of the challenges, and I'll try to go through these a little bit quicker. Shifting from a consultation accommodation mindset to partnership is a real change. There's a culture change element to that. Building relationships at the table based on trust and understanding is something that often just takes time, and it's hard to force it. And that's something that it's just a road we need to walk together. When we are making the kind of fundamental shifts that I've sort of described, we start to turn over and find that a lot of our existing policy approaches aren't really relevant, and we need to sort of rethink those. And so pretty significant policy and negotiation changes. And I spoke about culture change, and then implementation. When we're working together so closely, it changes the nature of the work we do and requires a bit of a different resource set. So Melissa, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about, on the next slide, about some of the forest policy pieces that are related to this.
Sure, thanks. And just knowing the time, I might, and noticing that I know you've heard some of the modernizing forest policy pieces earlier, I might go through this relatively quickly so we can turn over and have a bit of more of a discussion and leave space and time for that. I think when you listen to Tom talk about the reconciliation mandate the government is pursuing, you can see how when we take a look at how we modernize and change forest policy, reconciliation is actually a key part of that. So BC's forest policy framework, it was put in place nearly 2 decades ago, and has been inadequate to address today's challenges. And two of the main goals and efforts that you've probably heard earlier has been to take meaningful action on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and also, importantly for you, to increase inclusivity for communities who are interested in the forest sector and forest management, from tenure to local manufacturing. Slide, Michaela. Oh, sorry, wrong. Oh, joys of Zoom. Okay, I did mention earlier that I would talk a little bit about the Forest Range Practices Act yesterday. it is a key component of the Modernizing the Forest Policy initiative of government. So it could be a reading for you after this, and I can be put in the chat the new piece of legislation. But amendments were made to the FERPA yesterday. In the legislation, the minister introduced them to build on BC's, the government's vision on how to care for its forests. So this is where it ties into the stewardship piece. Legislation complements ongoing work to preserve old growth, which is a big topic right now, and support smarter management of forests, ensuring that public benefits are the priority. So it's also interesting, it will bring, a key part of the legislation is to replace the old forest stewardship plans, which were primarily developed by the sector, and will change them over time with forest landscape plans. The development, like what we view, the vision for this, is that through the development of forest landscape plans, the amendments will create new opportunities for shared decision-making, which Tom's referenced a few times, between government and First Nations. And we believe this is aligned with government's commitments to implement the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act passed in 2019. Now, just noting the time again, I'll just turn it back over to Tom to talk about some of the successes. And then I think what we want to do is here have a discussion around where you as a membership are seeing successes. Here's some examples of the partnerships. You know, we talk about this modernizing forest policy as, you know, there's pieces around tenure and stuff. The government's also really looking towards where these partnerships are taking place on their own. And there are some great success stories where, you know, you're hearing about a partnership between a community forest, and I really look forward to hearing about Quesnel. So Tom, over to you to close it off before we sign out.
Thanks, Melissa. I'll be just really quick. This is just a few recent agreements that you can look up or check out, which sort of reflect elements of some of the pieces that that I've kind of described and that Melissa's gone over. They're all online, public on our website, so go kind of have a read of them. The one remark I want to make is that these are agreements that are not sort of specifically within the context of the BC treaty process. And I want to address this head on because I know there's been some questions about it. You know, what's happening with the treaty process, or what are all these new reconciliation agreements? And I think what I want to sort of try to highlight, particularly as I know we'll be hearing from my dear old friend John Jack, who I worked with very, very closely when we were both working for Treaty Nations. This is the changes that I've reflected above are intended to be reflected not just in relationships with nations who are not involved in the treaty process, but in relationships with those who are. And so the kind of transformation that we're looking to achieve, and you'll see that if you look at the recognition of rights policy in the treaty process, is in both of those spheres. And we think ultimately the mode of reconciliation and how the journey that you're going to take to get there is just that. It's the way that you're going to frame and take the journey. The place that you're going to get to, the kind of appropriate sharing of resources, the building of sustainable revenue bases for the future to sustain future generations, the sharing of jurisdiction and authority that reflect a more equitable distribution, the kind of rebalancing of the division of powers in the Constitution, all those kinds of things. Those are things that are common across treaty and non-treaty tables. And so that distinction sort of blurs a little bit. And so where these are non-treaty arrangements, that's not intended to reflect kind of an exclusive, and by no means does it reflect kind of a preference. So I think I'll stop there. And I think, Melissa, we have the end of questions slide. And I think that about wraps it up for us, Melissa?
Yeah, I know. Sure. Why am I having trouble today with this? Yes, it does wrap it up for us, and I think I'll turn it back over to Craig to bring us along.
Perfect. And I've got to say thank you. That your timing was almost perfect. In fact, I think I might say it is perfect. I did not have to prompt anyone. We're about 25 minutes in, and we've got a few minutes here. I think especially for any clarifying comments or questions that are specific to the presentation that we heard, those would be super useful. If folks do have any clarifying questions, if you can put them into the chat for us. I'm just wondering, Melissa, there was one item there that caught my ear, and it was the development of sort of enabling policy or changes to see support for prescribed cultural burning. Really, I mean, obviously something very relevant. I know that this morning there was a lot of discussion about fire-affected communities and community forests. Can you just put a little bit more detail on that and what kind of opportunities or things that might open the door for in terms of a new tool for management?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And it is funny because I didn't think to put it in the presentation. Then hearing about it, I find that everywhere I go, I do. It comes up often, and it is viewed by many, and it is an example of Indigenous traditional knowledge. But from communities too, who say, look, there could be a better way to manage the landscape and to protect ourselves from wildfires. And so it is something that I think government has heard many times over the years. And when we do reviews of, specific wildfire seasons, I think 2017, 2018, there may have been mention in that as well of this. So when we were looking at the action plan and taking the feedback we've heard for years, and sorry, plugging the beeps on I don't know how to stop that, it became clear that this was a key issue that we wanted to explore and engage with First Nations on. So BC Wildfire Service is leading that right now. So it's a little early still, but it features heavily. And I just know that when I toured and I went and I met with chiefs in the Nicola, and you can kind of hear it, this idea that there may be a better way to do this and manage this. So it's something that BC Wildfire Service is quite keen to learn more about and to engage on. So it's kind of a stay tuned, but definitely it comes front and center right now.
Yeah, no, it's I think it's just a really good case study, I guess, of an area that can really have landscape level effects and really change, I think, how forest lands are managed and approached, whether it's in a community forest district or somewhere else.
Definitely, and Susan was saying that I might be able to watch the recording of the discussion that happened, and I said I'd do it over a weekend one time, because it sounds like it was a very interesting conversation. I just know that the Community Forest Association and communities around the province also have an interest in this, and sort of an interest in the fire smart programs and the fuel management. It's just so critical. So yeah, it's a great conversation to have.
Excellent. Okay, Susan, if there's nothing else that you want to raise at this point, I'm wondering if we should shift over to our sort of second block of presenters.
Sounds good.
Super. I think we've got Mayor Bob Simpson, Aaron Robinson, and Jean Christie to talk to us. I think a really concrete example of that community-based approach that's going on.
Great, thank you. We are speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Latakodeni Nation, one of the partners in our Community Forest Initiative. I'm just going to do a brief introduction context for the work that we're currently doing, and then Aaron and Jean will take over. They're part of our technical working group. I did see Aaron, the share screen pop up and then disappear. So I don't know when you're going to actually put that up. But and then at the end, I want to link back to the presentation we've just had, because the context for us working together to achieve a community forest, the new dynamic is UNDRIP and DRIPA and some of the hard work that's been mentioned in Tom and Melissa's presentation. I said to Susan and some others, it's a bit awkward for a community that doesn't have a community forest to be presenting to people who have had community forests for a very long time about where we're at in our fledgling enterprise. But it's not for lack of having an aspiration to have a community forest. The city of Quesnel first asked for a community forest back in 1997. And I think there's been 4 deliberate requests for a community forest over the years. We've always found it odd that as one of BC's most forest dependent communities, we've never been able to figure out how to get into the game and get direct association with an area-based license in our own timber harvesting land base and throughout the community. We started to talk in the early 2000s about the idea of linking community forest with fuel management and fire management. That was heightened as we approached 2017, 2018 fires here. And the Litaquadeni Nation and the city of Quesnel also approached the ministry together to attempt to get a community forest without success. Our last attempt to get recognized and to try to get a community forest ended up in the context of the Ministry of Forests and Lands doing the most recent annual allowable cut review, where we knew there was going to be a catastrophic decline in the available harvest. So I have to say that most of us entered it thinking that there was going to be too much of a Promethean task of trying to get a new license, trying to get some apportionment assigned to a community forest license. And yet we engaged in the process. We engaged ourselves as a city, and then all of the First Nations involved engaged. And lo and behold, our local forestry staff worked very hard and were very creative in creating, with the Chief Forester's Office, an annual allowable cut that made room for us. So as a consequence, we are now engaged in the process of a joint application, creating a joint application for community forest. And I'll let Erin walk you through where we're at currently and what the context is for that.
Okay, so in November of 2019, at the Quesnel Forestry Innovation Center, Ravi Kahlon, who was the parliamentary secretary for FLNRO at the time, together with First Nations leaders, as shown in the slide here, announced a new and fairly groundbreaking apportionment for the Quesnel TSA. Now, this apportionment was unique in that, in a departure from standard practice, local First Nations leadership and technical reps had been invited to work together with provincial staff on the development of various apportionment scenarios that could create more tenure opportunities for First Nations and local communities. And this work was informed by many years of negotiation and advocacy by First Nations and local government leaders to fundamentally change how territorial and local forests are managed and to carve out more meaningful roles in and benefits from the forest sector for communities. Now, the process was a challenging one. The 1-2 punch of mountain pine beetle and then the catastrophic mega fires had created a highly constrained timber supply environment. And additionally, each community had brought their own unique values, priorities, and interests to the table. However, though, despite these significant challenges, leadership and the technical and provincial reps were able to call on the strength of the existing relationships between the communities and keep focus on coming to a decision that would support 3 higher level objectives. And the first was to support reconciliation with Indigenous people. The second, to recognize the value of community involvement in local resource management. And lastly, to diversify the forest sector in and around Quesnel. And so in the end, this shared commitment did lead to an apportionment decision with the potential to satisfy all 3 of those shared objectives. The final apportionment increased First Nations replaceable volume holdings from 42,000 to 162,000 cubic meters, with an additional 77,000 cubic meters being set aside for a new community forest opportunity.
All right, so in January 2020, 6 governments in the Quesnel area, so that's Nazco, Litaquadeni, Esdala, Kluskus, First Nations, along with the City of Quesnel and the Caribou Regional District, received a letter from the province to organize a group between all of our governments for a potential community forest. So this wasn't an invitation to apply. It was an invitation to work together and begin to mobilize in anticipation of an invitation. This is an unusual way to have a community forest offered because normally groups self-organize, but in this case, the province was asking all of our groups to start relationship building together. This process, of course, was held up by COVID, but in June 2020, we were able to finally have our kickoff meeting in person. At this initial meeting, we began discussion of values and what type of land base we were after and what collective ideas we had our community forest or saw it serving. Soon after this meeting, we began working with a lawyer on a participation agreement that outlined what we call our technical working group, which you'll see are staff level people on the slide, and the partner group, which are the elected officials who provide strategic direction. So this is a way for our group to keep the technical aspects of the process moving forward while the political aspects work themselves out. Because this, could cause further delays in an already very long process. An example of this is when the Cariboo Regional District was deciding if they wanted to be a partner or not. And so in the months that took them to decide if they were going to engage or not, our technical working group could keep the process moving along. Looks like you need to mute. Along the same lines, at this point in the process, Kluskus First Nation is available to our group only intermittently. They don't attend all of the meetings, but it allows our partners to keep working together, and they're still part of the participation agreement. And this speaks to the relationships built up to this point.
Great, thanks, Erin. So at this stage, the technical working group has begun the process of area selection by examining various units and combination of units with the potential to support the volume allocated to the CFA. Now, given the constrained timber supply, it's not surprising that technical and leadership group members have on several occasions raised the question of whether or not the volume is even there to be found. And while we're confident that the fiber itself is out there, a more appropriate question may be whether a land base exists, which will not only support the volume, but will also support the management of our shared ecosystem and community values, most of which are best managed at the landscape level. And realistically, we understand that it's unlikely that there is an area that will support all our values all at once. And because of that, we know that our values and our objectives and priorities will need to be considered and balanced, and that trade-offs and compromise will be required from all parties as we move forward. Notably, for the First Nations communities, the situation is made even more complex by their ongoing work to land their newly expanded replaceable forest licenses and by their high-level negotiations with provincial and federal governments related to title and other land-based rights. And while this remains to be challenging, the area selection process is giving us a glimpse of what is to come under the province's vision for the future of forest management and tenure reform, like we've been hearing about today. Despite how they are often understood and sometimes portrayed, communities, First Nations particularly, are not monoliths with neatly overlapping sets of goals and values. And so much trust and respect and communication, relationship building is required to come to an agreement on what is most important to the collective. And then from there to carve out new roles and opportunities in the forest sector that will meaningfully benefit all of the communities involved.
So since our very first meeting, our group has been talking about our collective values. The collective values we have to date focus first and foremost on ecosystem and forest-based forest management. This and all the related things that go along with this: landscape level management, wildfire protection, trails and recreation, timber supply, and fiber utilization. And then we have a second bullet or pillar that you'll see up there where we have our business and operating principles. And this includes values that benefit all of the partners: collaboration on projects, training and human resource development, job creation, and investing in our communities. It's important to note that our intention is to manage the potential CFA as a collective. We see the CFA as an important opportunity for us to work together as neighbors on projects that benefit all of our communities.
Thanks, Erin and Jean. I think
There's the final slide. Sorry.
So thank you. So to pull this together in terms of the panel that we're on with respect to reconciliation, I was an MLA for 2 terms and spoke at many occasions at home and prefaced my remarks with recognition of the Latakodeni Territory, Southern Carrier Nation. And my very first time as mayor, speaking at a public gathering, the MP spoke before me, the MLA spoke before me. They both recognized the Latako traditional territory. And when I got up to the mic, I couldn't. And I couldn't do it because now as mayor of the city of Quesnel, the city of Quesnel actually had no formal recognition whatsoever of Latakodeni, and they could and they should have that. So I couldn't verbalize something that the city actually didn't recognize in reality. Went back to council, and we had quite a substantive conversation about what it meant for us to quote unquote recognize the traditional territory of Latakodeni and the Southern Carrier in reality. And we've now recognized Latakodeni throughout all of our buildings and facilities. We have a protocol agreement with the nation, and we're working with other nations that are part of this partnership. But as part of the council discussion, we talked about the fact that reconciliation needed to lead towards true partnerships. We needed to look for opportunities to work together on real projects. And we have a number of projects in play just now. But it was interesting because when this one unfolded, we really resisted the ministry's efforts to get all of the governments to collaborate, the Cariboo Regional District, the City of Quesnel, and the 4 First Nations, because we thought it was a really awkward way to go through what is at best an awkward process. As you all know, getting a community force is a lot of hard work. There's a lot of hard decisions to be made, and to have a 6 government collective on the ground floor, we felt was going to be really troublesome. And we did have some issues with the Cariboo Regional District because of their work because they work under the Local Government Act. It was difficult for them to be able to respond even with the speed and the taxation function that the municipality could, let alone the autonomy and ability for the First Nations to make similar decisions. So they backed out. We actually went back to the ministry a couple of times, quite frankly, and said, look, can you not just give the license to the City of Quesnel? Can you not just give the license to the City of Quesnel and Latako? And then we can create a governance structure sitting over top of the license that meet the ministry's desire to have it as this larger collaborative. And they kept pushing us to stay the course and look for the opportunities to do it from the ground up as a partnership with the First Nations governments and with ourselves now as the City of Quesnel, with the regional district having to back out. And I have to say that I think that that's going to end up in a much better arrangement, a much deeper set of relationships among all of us, as much as it continues to be hard work. And I want to reference what Tom and Melissa were saying. The other context for us on this is that the ground shifted with respect to our understanding of nation-to-nation, government-to-government dialogue with the province's tabling of the DRIPA legislation and recognizing UNDRIP. And that continues to be a struggle for lots of organizations, including First Nations, as to what does that really mean? What does government-to-government truly mean in that case? And it adds a bit of a strangeness as well from a local government perspective, because, of course, the municipal governments, regional districts are not government in that sense, recognized in DRIPA and UNDRIP, because we're just a child of the province. That That hard work, though, as I've said, is really driving us to have deeper relationships with each other, to work through the difficulties that we've got. We're in the land-based discussion phase now. I'll be meeting with one of our partners next week to talk about whether we can have them see the land-based discussion differently than we're currently seeing. So, I think the honesty and frankness of the conversations we're having with each other, because we've got a real project, we have a real opportunity to work together with a land base that we have common interests in, and we have a common desire to manage through an ecological resiliency lens and with a view to protecting all of our communities from future fires, as well as the other values, the recreation values, et cetera there. So I think, as much as it's hard work, it's really good work. And, I have to say, and I've said it to the district manager now, who's now the regional executive director, that it was great that he did continue to push us to take this course of action. The other piece of it is, I think, is going to have a spillover. The work we're doing together with the smaller land base of the community forest is going to spill over, because we're a landscape planning pilot under the new legislation that's just been tabled this week. So we're out ahead of that, and many of the same players that we're working with together on this small footprint are going to be working together on the larger timber supply area with a view to getting to a landscape plan in a collaborative way. We've got a lot of work still to do, and with some of the horsepower we have and people like you're seeing with Aaron and Jean and some of the other folks that are working on the technical side, I think we're going to get good products put in front of the leadership team. And at the end of the day, as long as we keep grounding ourselves in the values that we all aspire to and all agree to, I think we're going to have a stellar application put in the hopefully near future. That remains to be seen how quickly we can get there.
Thank you so much, all of the presenters from Quesnel. That's, I think, an excellent start. I wonder if we can move right along to John Jack, who's our next presenter from Huu-ay-aht First Nation. John, do you want to take us off here? I know you've got some time constraints.
I'll try to go as quickly as possible. So I think we've had some specific examples of reconciliation efforts done by local governments and with the province in regards to what they're doing, and UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People legislation, as well as being very focused on being responsive to the idea that relationships matter. So I'm going to try to cover that off in a way that's a bit more hopefully a little more on the ground, some tips and tricks in order to really get moving forward as the boards or the administration of a community forest and moving forward. So this has been adapted from what I presented at the Union of BC Municipalities. So there's kind of some local government language in there, but hopefully we can clear that up as time goes by. So reconciliation is a word that is not necessarily controversial, but it's something that often confuses people. I found that the best way to think of reconciliation is by thinking of it as a process of improving the abstract relationship between Indigenous peoples and their communities and the peoples and communities within BC and Canada. And it's that abstract nature of reconciliation that really puts people off when they're talking about it, because it becomes less of a real thing. So if we think of it as being abstract, we can break it up into different components, and those components can be understood more specifically. And you can create strategies to implement reconciliation initiatives that are just straight on the ground, doing the work of it in a boardroom with people you know, to something more abstract like the creation of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. We won't go into that much detail, but I think it's really important to break up the idea of reconciliation into three main categories. So the first category is the most familiar for a lot of folks, and I think that's political/legal reconciliation. So these are things you hear about when it comes to treaty, when it comes to self-government agreements or access and ownership to lands and resources. Tom McCarthy spoke on the creation of agreements that exist outside of treaty and outside of court. And I think that's a very important thing to note, because there are only a handful of nations in BC that have self-governing agreements, and there are even fewer who have treaties, full-on modern final agreements with the Crown. I come from a nation with a treaty, and therefore we have the most comprehensive approach to self-government this side of Nisga'a or Tsawwassen. And so, that being said, those foundation agreements, those reconciliation agreements, or other types of agreements that establish more decision-making authority, more ownership and control of land and resources for First Nations, is something that will continue into the future. And these are in stark difference from the court's decisions. Now, the idea that the courts create room for governance and self-government and land ownership is there. It happened with Chilcotin. But really what they're doing is using a court process to go into a negotiation process. So why not skip that and go with the negotiation? So that's political or legal reconciliation. That's establishing the tools of decision-making. Another core part of reconciliation is social/education reconciliation. This is what the media talks a lot about in regards to place names, naming buildings or taking the names off of buildings to really show a degree of recognition and respect for First Nations within the constructs of Canada and BC. This is also statues and monuments and providing space for First Nations people to exist and see things that welcome them and really underline the fact that they're a part of Canadian society. And then lastly, we have economic or business reconciliation. This is relatively new in terms of people talking about reconciliation, but these are things like partnerships and joint ventures and impact benefits agreements and those kind of things, the things that are strictly about access to resources for economic purposes in exchange for money or jobs or the both. This is also where community forests come in, because it also includes things like woodlot licenses, partial or entire ownership of tree farm licenses, or community forests. And so these are the types of things, if you break reconciliation down into the political, the social, and the economic, that helps it tear it off as a more digestible piece. We can also get into understanding that UNDRIP legislation and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as the calls to action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, these are all great places to start, but they're once again really abstract, and therefore we really need to pull it down to earth and think about reconciliation in terms of what First Nations are trying to do as communities and as leaders and as individuals, and how that interacts with how you as individuals, organizations, and communities act as well. And how can we come together and reconcile? How can we understand and accept the fact that no one's going anywhere, but how do we make room for one another? And how do we make room for First Nations to feel included in all of the processes that exist in our politics, in our social fabric, and in our economy? And this is probably the main focus here, is the economy and the politics. Reconciliation is about managing relationships. It's about creating trust and consistency over time so that you can talk about common interests and talk about interests in a way that can resolve issues before they crop up. This is built on a foundation of recognition of the place of First Nations on these lands and in this territory, and respecting their place in that. And so that doesn't really mean anything until you start thinking about what are the components or ways in which you can think about relationship building, especially when it's an abstract relationship between a community and a community. Because it's not like the relationship between the two individuals or two families. It's a historically informed relationship between large groups of people that becomes very abstract if we don't start thinking about it in terms of what happens on the ground. So we can think of the relationship between Indigenous communities and other communities in Canada or BC or the federal government. We can also think about individual relationships. So let's pull that apart and say we have individual relationships and we have collective relationships. These two things interact when we're talking about reconciliation, when we're talking about any relationship building between any organization or group, and so on and so forth. There are formal relationships, there are professional relationships, and there are informal relationships. And where these relationships take place matter as well, because there are relationships that exist kind of on the stage in front of people. There are also relationships in the media and in front of a large group of people witnessing a signing or that sort of thing. Then there are another level is boardroom relationships, where decisions get made kind of behind closed doors, the matters of governance and business, where the decisions are being made that will affect people, but need to be made behind closed doors. And then there's the working group relationship, where people who are working for an Indigenous community or for a company or for a local government sit in a room together, often with delegated authority from a higher decision-making group like a board or a council or so on and so forth. And they sit down and they hammer out the actual details of what it is we're going to be doing and why and how we're going to get there. And these things all matter. And they matter because First Nations communities think of relationships in terms of it existing on certain levels. Before contact, First Nations didn't have the written word, and therefore many of the agreements between families within a nation or between nations, when it comes to mutual protection or trade agreements or access to resources, these things were negotiated in front of their people. Chiefs would sit in a circle, and then they'd have their advisors next to them. But then the people would sit around them. And those people witnessed what was going on and why these things were being spoken about. And then when you had interactions between two separate tribes, those tribes would come together in a large feast, a potlatch. And the businesses that would be conducted on the floor would talk about things like trade agreements or mutual protection or access to resources. And both sides would act out their interests in front of both populations of people. And it would be the job of the people who were in attendance to remember what's going on. And so if a mutual protection pact was negotiated between two tribes, but it only becomes relevant 40 years later, then the veracity and the terms of that agreement may depend on that 15-year-old snot-nosed kid sitting in the back corner remembering exactly why it was stated. Now, I'm not saying this because that's what you need to do, but rather that culture informs the expectations of the citizens and therefore the leaders within a First Nations community. And so when they do governance by the big house fire, they know that their constituents, their people, expect to know why we're doing a thing and how long it's going to last, to a degree that is only being contemplated now because of the advent of social media. And those relationships need to be managed. First Nations have different components of their decision-making. They have their elected governments. They may have a traditional hereditary government, as well as an administrative government. Each of these things have different aspects that you need to consider. If a First Nation, for instance, has 2-year terms of office, that means that you're only seeing about 1 year of work going on. And then the campaign period starts, or settling out from the last campaign period starts. And therefore, you may not see a lot of consistency coming through on the First Nations council or elected government. What you may see, though, is that First Nations that have 2-year election cycles may rely heavily on the corporate memory of their chief administrative officers. And therefore, the real people you need to make sure that you inform as to what's going on will be your chief administrators, will be your band managers. There are different titles for all of these things, but that administration to administration relationship will matter, and understanding how those dynamics shift and work can have an impact on how you create those relationships and move forward. I think first and foremost, though, and how this really affects, because that's a lot. I've spoken a lot about the different characteristics of relationship building and the different characteristics and components of how First Nations may make decisions for themselves. But ultimately, reconciliation is about becoming what we should have been, both for First Nations becoming what they should have been if things were better for them earlier in history, but also Canada becoming what it should have been. BC becoming what it should have been. We're working to rectify the mistakes made in the past in order to create a better future for First Nations people, but ultimately for everyone in BC and Canada, because we're waking up now. And this is why the abstract nature of reconciliation bothers some people. We're waking up now to the power of soft power, of those types of non-mathematics based creators of value that weren't necessarily contemplated back in the days of, we can harvest this many trees, we can process this many trees through the sort, this is what the values are here, this is how much money we make. Well, there's more involved in that now, and how people make decisions and how they treat the land based on environmental values, cultural resource values, as well as just general relationships between the interested parties. These things will inform how decisions get made within First Nations, and therefore need to be contemplated by anyone who interacts with them, understanding where they're coming from and how they evaluate the trees on the land or the timber on the ground, and what that means to them can point you in the right direction of what to do and how to create a good relationship moving forward. Because I don't know if you've picked up on the subtext here, but BC is moving on reconciliation. There are things that are happening from the top down that are going to happen regardless of whether or not people don't like them or don't understand, because it can't wait. And therefore, seeing that moving ahead in the future, you can do things to create a relationship built on that trust and consistency, built on the foundation of recognition and respect, so that you're prepared for when that time comes where your community forest will likely involve First Nations that hadn't been involved before. In fact, you might be best suited to start working on the idea of inviting First Nations to become a part of the community forest and sharing in that power, because it's probably coming. Now, I don't know if that's going to be soon or slightly later from now, but these are the types of things that we need to contemplate as citizens in BC, and what it is we want to build moving forward. And ultimately, the idea is that a better relationship between British Columbians and the communities within it and First Nations within BC is that the potential for value creation, whether it be good relationships in the social aspects or lack of perceived obstacles on the political side, or just the bald-faced creation of economic value on a global market. These things all open up if the relationship is there. The idea here is that we're going to share in the fruits of that work, because First Nations will have more trust in what's going on, and therefore be more open to doing things in such a way that suits competitiveness on a global scale when it comes to forestry. Now, community forests have a small player to play in that on the whole, but it'll be community-based initiatives that will help make these things work without them becoming partisan issues. And we got to keep it that way. It doesn't matter how we vote federally or provincially. What matters is that we ensure that we understand that we're living together and doing the right things to do right by one another. And there is still room to create value and share in that growth. And I could go on, but I know that there's more to be said. So I'll cut myself off there. I'd like to thank everyone for having me. And Craig, please take it.
Thank you, John Jack. That I think that's a lot to chew on, and some pretty deep and meaningful words. abstract maybe, but I think what we're seeing here is this combination of the very concrete and the very abstract. These old historical relationships, this need to become what we should have been and do right by each other. And then how does that get anchored into the roots of the forest, the ground that we walk on? I would love to turn it around. I know that John Jack, you've got some commitments that you need to see to in 10 minutes or so. If anybody has any clarifying things, special questions for John in particular, let's invite those first. And then if there are some, that's great. If not, I'd love to hear from, and again, please use the chat. Susan has her eyes on that. So if you've got questions for John, please bring them into the chat now while we can still benefit from him. And I'm also interested, I'd love to hear from the other community forests in the room. When you're hearing these words from any of these presenters, whether it's the government of BC talking about the higher level things that are going on, whether we're talking about Quesnel's experience at the grassroots of having the challenge of working across these multiple relationships, or what you're hearing from John Jack in terms of where we're really headed, what's the big idea here. How does that fit with your experiences as a community forest? Where do you see the challenges? Where do you see the opportunities? I think that kind of a conversation would be really useful.
I have the power to unmute myself, so I'm going to just throw this out, John Jack, because I know it's something that other people have mentioned to me. So here we are, and we're in a situation where we refer to 17 or 23 different communities, First Nations communities. By law, we have to do that with our plans. And yet there's a First Nations community just down the lake, but we don't really have a relationship with them. And we may have tried once upon a time, or we've reached out, but we haven't really met with success. Can you do you have any ideas about that, how to proceed?
Yeah, I think at first, maybe doing a bit of desktop study, a bit of reconnaissance really helps. So most First Nations now are very active on Facebook. So trying to get, and I know it's a thing, right? But getting active and liking their page and trying to join with good reason, join any Facebook groups that are devoted to your local First Nations really helps you get an understanding of what it is they're focusing on and what it is they're trying to achieve within their own governance structures. Not all First Nations have a good website, but some do. And when, like, for instance, my First Nation, you can find out a lot about what we're planning, what we're hoping to do moving forward and into the future with treaty, with self-government, with our economic development initiatives. And it really just comes down to, do you have the time to sit down for 90 minutes for a while, for a couple of weeks, maybe once a week, and just really reading about your neighbors and what's going on? And then you get a sense of what their flow looks like, what it is they're preparing for, whether or not they're having community meetings, and so on and so forth, and whether or not an election is coming up. Because it's a bad time to really talk to a First Nation when there's about to be an election, because everything's in the air. And you don't know what the process is going to look like of if a whole new government is put in, are they going to fire everyone in the office? That rarely happens now, but that is something that can happen after an election. So you really want to have a good baseline understanding of what the First Nations look like and what they're doing. Then second, you really want to understand what it is are the stated objectives of a sitting government and the objectives of the people, if that's something that's apparent. And then you can start to really try to network in and have discussions with, if not a chief counselor or the whole council, one counselor, or an administrative individual, the equivalent of a city manager or the equivalent of a economic development officer. They usually have forward-facing individuals who do interact with businesses and community organizations in a way that will help kind of on-ramp you into whatever their structures may look like. Learning as much as you can at your desk is probably the first step. Second is maybe to have conversations with individuals in MLA offices or city hall. Mayor Bob was talking about everything that they've done in interacting with one another. If you're from a community forest and you don't necessarily have, and you're owned by the RD instead of the city, interact with people in the city. Maybe they have a better relationship or something like that, and go from there. It can start with a phone call, but it can start slower and a little more, with a little more process involved, if that makes people more comfortable. And there's nothing wrong with that, because forward momentum is still forward momentum. And you really want to do a lot of the work for First Nations, because most of them are overtaxed, they're just so busy and overstretched. Council members are doing administrative work. Administrators are doing, public relations and government relations work. And so you really want to do as much work as you can to meet them more than halfway. So don't just invite them to come to see you. Go to see them in both a physical sense and a metaphysical sense, that you're doing the work in regards to doing that. It's a lot like what people are trying to teach in regards to personal relationships, is that you have to do the emotional and intellectual work of managing the relationship as well. It's not just up to the wife to do all that stuff. You have to start thinking about it too. It's that kind of thing. And yeah, it's starting and moving forward. And if you don't catch a chief counselor or all of council for some big event, try to just go have lunch or grab coffee with one member of council or one economic development officer, and just go from there and just build out.
John, that was incredible. And this is Jennifer Gunter from the Community Forest Association. And I just so appreciate your remarks, and especially what you just said about doing the work. And I guess my question is, how about for a provincial level association like the BC Community Forest Association? What kind of advice do you have for us?
I think the number one piece of advice I would give to community forest associations is not to focus on Aboriginal or Indigenous provincial associations. That's a place for you to do the work. But when you're interacting and giving advice to local governments or to local community forest community forests, is to really contemplate the idea of the bilateral relationship, and that the Community Forest Association should focus primarily on, I don't think you have the resources or the time to create your own bilateral relationships, but the experiences of your members can come to places like this and talk about their experiences and what's going right, what's going wrong, and moving that forward as a standing agenda item or some informal kind of conversation after or before an AGM. And that when you're talking about your association as a whole, I think you're the ones who really need to understand what the province is looking to do and how that may affect your constituents in terms of your members, but also just like the policy and the knock-on effects of what the province may want to do. How can you mitigate the scariness of anything that may be coming that seems vague? Or how can you inform your constituents so that they don't react poorly? My big concern about when it comes to anything land resource economy related is that stuff that the province does on behalf of reconciliation is often viewed by many constituents within BC as a threat to their livelihood or the lifeblood of their organization in some way. It doesn't need to be that way, but like I said, it takes the work. The association can be an enabler of each of these community forests, doing a bit of the work to understand, okay, what's coming down the pipe? All right, the avalanche has already started. It's too late for the Pebbles to hold a vote. But what can we do to join up in this and make it as painless as possible, but also be committed to the understanding that we're not losing anything. We're bringing more people on board to make our decisions more legitimate, to make the decisions and the decisions that we're making on the land for the land way more legitimate. And how can we create a relationship that will allow and create the trust that a First Nation will listen to what your experts have to say in a community forest to manage it well for both revenue and sustainability. Because when a First Nation sits down with you for the first time, even if they haven't thought about forestry at all, they're going to learn a lot about forestry and what the interests are of the forestry sector, even if it's a community forest. And First Nations that might be thinking that, oh yeah, we really support Fairy Creek, it's what's happening is really awful. You can be an enabler of information that's going to flow to them that go, well, if you actually look at the forestry practices within BC, they really are amongst the best in the world. And there's a lot of work that goes into managing old growth. And there's a lot of work that goes into managing the effect of the watershed and so on and so forth. And then those First Nations can understand that, oh, maybe a community forest's interests are pretty much the same as ours. And we're all trying to do the same thing here. And that is where we want to get. Because as Hwayet, we're involved in TFL 44. We've been involved as a stepping stone community forest and having a small salvage company back in the 90s. That our understanding of forestry is such that it is a vital component of our economy, which is a vital component of BC's economy. And the only way that it's going to work is if we're competitive on the global scale, because that's where timber and lumber and all these things are it's all managed economically in one global market. It's not just the island. It's not just BC. We have to pull together, but how we pull together is going to take a lot of collaboration and understanding of what our interests are. And for First Nations, it's not just money, although money matters. It's also, are there opportunities for First Nations people to be involved in the management of land that was taken away from them? Many First Nations don't care about whether or not they own the land as long as they have a say in how the land is managed for future generations. And just getting in the chair and having people be there will raise a base level of trust and understanding. And you can learn from one another based on that and make the appropriate decisions for whatever compromise may move forward. And that will help open up opportunity for global competitiveness, let alone just having an economy in BC altogether.
Thank you.
I think I took your question and just ran with it, but thank you.
That's great. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John. It's been really valuable having you here. Really grateful.
I'd like to really appreciate the work that Quesnel has done on setting up their community forest. That's a case study in how to do it. And I would actually really look at how they're moving forward and what their plans might be for instances in the future of policy change or what they look to do to expand that. So thank you.
Just if it's appropriate, I'd love to hear a little bit more. Several of the folks in the chat have sort of surfaced this idea of becoming what we should have been. John, one of your words there, sets of words there. And I'd love to hear from the Quesnel folks actually about how does that feel, especially in a situation where Quesnel is working to establish a community forest in a place where there's, well, we're not starting at the square one of history. We're not starting with a fiber supply that is abundant and has never been cut before. We're starting with a constrained supply, and yet trying to get to this place where we should have been, becoming what we should have been. I'm just curious how that feels for your team.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I think Aaron and Jean will be able to contribute. I think to a certain extent, the fact that we're so heavily constrained and that we've been subjected to such large-scale disturbances, particularly in recent years, the Quesnel timber supply area is the hardest hit on a volume basis, timber volume basis, by Mount Pine Beetle, followed by the 2017 fires having the largest landscape fire scar with the Plateau Fire, and then subsequent fires in 2018. We're now having all of the hydrological impacts as a result of a denuded land base as well. So it almost compels us to look through that lens of doing things differently as opposed to normatively. And it's an ongoing conversation we actually have with the Chief Forester's office, because we see too much of normative forest management still coming out of the Chief Forester's office because of their timber focus. So I think to a certain extent, we just have a compelling reason for all of us to do something differently that is a stimulus for the conversations we want to have about having different relationships and about managing the land base differently. And I think a different circumstance where, we had, a big AAC available to us, the industry was ticking along, there was money to be made, all of that stuff might have been a different environment. And the second piece, though, is we learned early at the city level that we have to be ready for slow conversations. We tend to get into the trap of wanting to have business relationships. And we certainly got there when we first embarked on our desire to move down the path of reconciliation. We asked everybody who we should start with, and it was clear that Litakodeni were, the nation that we had to come together with, because the footprint of the city of Quesnel is clearly in their territory. And so we thought, okay, a couple months with them, and then a couple months with NASCO, and a couple months with Estela, and we'll have these protocol agreements, we'll all be good, and we can move on. We were 18 months of pretty interesting conversations, sitting with elders, sitting with leadership. I was taught how to drum. I learned how to dance. We sat and heard stories. We broke bread together. And I think that's another aspect to it is while climate change is robbing us of the luxury of time, we also have to be willing to invest the time to be able to get to the meaningful foundational relationships, to then be able to get to the meaningful partnerships rather. Aaron and Jean?
Yeah, I don't really have too much more to add except just those layers of relationships that John and Mayor just talked about. The community level is quite an abstract idea. And so it really comes down to those working relationships, between individuals to drive this process along.
And I'll just add that, despite the challenges in trying to balance kind of the specific priorities and business directions that the individual nations are trying to head in, we do have the benefit of really close family ties between the communities. One thing that all the First Nations communities that we're working with have in common is a great care and respect for each other. And so as the First Nations are developing their relationship with the city, those nation-to-nation relationships exist and are strong and are, from my opinion, working for Litaco, one of the greatest strengths of our collective.
Thank you. Excellent comments. I'd encourage folks. We've still got some time together, and so if there are questions ranging from the concrete to the more abstract, please get them in there. One of the questions that I saw in the chat there, I think was for the province. And the idea of situating this work in the realm of policy versus legislation, and how do you feel about that? And I wonder how that works for the interests of individual community forests who are sort of looking for guidance, and it may not quite be there yet in the realm of legislation.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and Tom had to step away briefly, so he probably would have been the best person to answer this, but I'll try and take it. The reason I think we're looking at when it comes to government-to-government relationships is we don't want to be prescriptive in legislation, and legislation can sometimes be a bit prescriptive, and we have to be flexible because the discussions change and the government-to-government relationship is different depending on where you are and who you're speaking with. So that is one of the reasons. That said, one of the key priorities of government that has been mentioned within the Declaration Act is to start to align legislation with the Declaration Act. So when you take a look at, I think Section 7 was mentioned a few times. I know Al Dro's comment too on shared decision making, making sure that when government and nations want to enter into a shared decision making agreement, that is possible under provincial legislation. So some of the bigger pieces are centered, the alignment of laws is definitely a key priority for us, and something that we're all working on. But when it comes to sort of the government-to-government relationship and how that works at the table, the flexibility is important. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
no, I think that's good to hear. In terms of the flexibility, and my sense is that would also, it allows for flexibility for things to sort of take shape differently in different parts of BC, depending on the different nations, but also potentially the different involvement of different community forests. And I'm curious how, actually any of the presenters or folks on the call here may see things being different in different regions of BC, how these things work out differently in different places.
I think it was said by a presenter, and I couldn't remember if it was Jean. It's not a monolith. First Nations are not a monolith. There are different interests depending on where you are in the province, depending where their territory is. They have their own interests. So, I think that I agree wholeheartedly with that, and that's why there is some flexibility. And then how a community forest starts to approach a nation and builds relationships is really, I think John gave such great advice. I can't really top any of that. And I think the mayor also was able to talk about the relationships and the hard work that goes into it. But it is area, it's on whose territory you're residing and trying to make that work, that those will be unique relationships across the board. Mayor, did you want to add to that? I see you popped on.
Yeah, Melissa, thanks. And one of the questions begged for us, and maybe Melissa, you could even speak to what the thinking is. So we've got the issues associated with all of the community forests have under existing legislation, where once we become a tenure holder, we become subjected to all of the regulations around holding that tenure, the silviculture strategies and so on. Whereas in our case, we were asking questions around the fact that, well, we want to manage an interface area for interface values, right, which are going to be different than timber values in some cases. We want to, do some fire breaks. We want to introduce more deciduous in areas and so on. So there's that level of flexibility that's going to be needed, and we're having those conversations. But I think the bigger question begged, and particularly with First Nations coming in and local governments coming in at the ground level on the landscape planning exercise that we're now going to be embarking on. Well, again, that issue of scale, the Quesnel timber supply area that we're going to be planning is going to be needing different things than even the Williams Lake one to the south of us or the Prince one, George one to the north of us. And do you have a sense of how the regulations are going to unfold to embed some of that flexibility in, to do more discrete planning and to do more discrete prescriptions to make sure that we are actually rehabbing the land base the way the land base needs to be rehabbed, and not by a set of omnibus regulations that are province-wide?
Yeah, I think it's I work right next door to Diane Nichols, who's our chief forester. So it's not my area of expertise around the forest landscape plan piece that they brought in. A lot of thought has gone into it, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done around the regulations. And so there is, plans to sort of start to engage as that work goes on to figure out how this will all come together and work in an appropriate way. So there is continued engagement across the province with nations. I think also the pilot projects that are happening in your area, there's, I want to say 5 of them taking place across the province that will help inform some of this work as they move forward, just to see how it works, see what needs to be tweaked, and how to fit that into the regulations. So there is still work to be done. It's kind of, I've always heard FERPA is a bit of an iterative process. It will take some time as we start to develop and watch best practice and see how things all work together. But there is still work ahead of us on that one.
Yeah.
Susie and team, other issues or items that you think should be brought forward from today's
Jen has a question there.
Super. Oh, great. Jen, please go.
Okay. Oh gosh. Okay, thank you. Melissa, I think this is a question for you, and I apologize. I'm not sure if you covered this off in your presentation, but I'm just thinking back, to different engagement processes that community forests have been involved in the last few years, and conferences. Like I'm thinking of the Resiliency Conference that took place in Burns Lake a few years ago. And it was at the start of conversations around landscape level planning. But what we found was that a lot of the issues that the communities, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, were bringing up, the response is often, well, okay, that's not forest practices, that's a land use planning issue. And so I'm curious about kind of an update on where we're at in BC with respect to modernizing land use plans. And if you have any information to share on that. I guess that's the main question. And then the other is, okay, and then how does that fit with the forest landscape planning framework?
Yeah, and I am not, I don't have landscape or land use planning in my file, but I can tell you it is definitely something that every day becomes more evident that work needs to be done on this. And there has been tremendous work across the province at different and in sort of different ways around land use planning that, sometimes connects. And I think with what I've been told with the forest landscape plan piece is they're kind of smaller scale and they're focused more on the forest itself, whereas the land use planning can be much more broad. And you've seen it. We have land use planning taking place in the Northeast and different tables that our city just sort of come up with these plans. I think one of the commitments government has made and that they made and is being currently worked on, and I don't know if some of you may have been engaged on this process too, is the creation of a new land-focused ministry within government. So the idea that they'll take, because it's become quite a big part of the work of FLNRO, of environment, of every ministry in government is kind of working on land use planning. So it's still a huge priority. And we're just trying to figure out how to do it the most efficient and effective way possible while engaging with our partners across the province. So it's definitely, I have a bunch of colleagues who work almost continuously heads down on land use planning.
Jennifer, good to see you online. It's been a while. We got an update at the Fraser Basin Council last week on how the province is approaching the land use plan portion of this. And like you, a number of us had questions of how do you bring these two together? And one of the things we've experienced at the early part of the table, and the landscape pilot here was stymied a little bit on the front end, as I indicated, even with our own community forest, with people having to really understand what DRIPA means when First Nations come to the table as a government, because they can't be lumped in as First Nations and other stakeholders, as a lot of them are pushing back on. So we've had a bit of a delay as FLNRO has worked through with the various First Nations on, what does that look like, et cetera. But almost on every occasion, part of the issue is the conflation of land use planning and landscape level planning, and trying to really understand the dynamic tension between those two things. And the situation we have in Quesnel is actually compounded even further because we're also a pilot for spatializing the AAC. And the minute you go to spatialize the AAC, you bump up against the land use plans, right? So we've got that question writ large as we start to convene our real working tables this November. We think we've got the right arrangements and people understand sort of the roles, and we're going to be there. But even in the presentation we got at Fraser Basin Council, there was still a lot of questions around how do you bring these disparate initiatives together. The final point I'll make is that ours is further complicated because the Kirby-Tricot land use plan is one of the few legal land use plans. So ours is actually not being looked at as one of the early land use planning exercises because of the complications associated with the legal aspect of those plans. Yet the minute we get into landscape level planning, it's going to be asked. And then if you try and spatialize the cut, it's going to be asked. So I think there's, as I said earlier, these are very hard conversations, and it's going to take a lot of goodwill around the table to work our way through them.
I think the mayor, you're speaking to almost like it's a bit of a microcosm of some of the challenges, but some of the conversations that need to take place, and I think that's why this dialogue I was so interested to hear, because to hear it put that way, which is what we're kind of all thinking too, is just it's a great example. And there's work to be done for sure. And it's not gonna, some of it's not gonna happen overnight, but there's definitely a motivation to work on this. So
thank you. It sounds like it needs to be a topic for a future BCCFA conference.
Yes.
Once you guys figure it all out, come back and presentation.
We'll make sure to.
I just add, when John Jack was speaking, I think to Susie, your first question, and he was talking about, go online, go onto the Facebook pages, things like that. The other thing that was going through my head was the amazing work that many nations have done around land use planning. Quite regularly, those land use plans are public documents. One thing I would add also is that sometimes they're called land use plans, sometimes they're not. Sometimes what you see is this incredibly valuable vision or mission statement or something like that really lays out the fundamentals of land use planning as well in a culturally appropriate way that works for the nation. And that can be a really important entry point, I think, for Susie Community Forests or others who are wanting to say, hey, we've got this thing going on over here. We want to build relationships with nations in our area. How do we do it? Those kinds of outward facing vision statements, land use plans, that sort of thing can be a really useful way to start the conversation and say, look, I've read this. I understand that your nation this is one of your big goals. We think this could really fit with some of the directions that our community forest is going. So just a note there.
Yeah, that, Craig, I think is a really good connection point. And I would say, like, land use planning can be a broad term, but across the province, there are tables that are working on, broad land use planning plans, but also just specific area specific, topic specific. And it is, hearing what John said about going on Facebook and learning about who your neighbors are. And this would be another great example to sort of see what's on folks' mind. And land use planning, there's a lot of work between government and municipalities and nations across the province on these initiatives. So it's a good connection point, Craig.
Yes, I'd just like to add too that I've learned that a lot of First Nations who maybe don't have a land use plan, they've started and they've identified their values. So it can be of value to ask them, what's important to you on the land? What values do you care the most about? And maybe it's white bark pine and mountain goats, but that can be a tangible area of mutual agreement that, yes, we care about that too. Can be a start. I'm seeing Albert with a question about how do landscape level planning differ from current forest management plans? Melissa, is that something you want to speak to briefly?
I think that, I can send some information in the chat box. I think landscape level planning is getting down to, it's bringing government and nations and communities back into the driver's seat of how we manage places on the landscape with regard to timber, to harvesting, to roads. So it sort of is a bit more, brings back a bit more local autonomy compared to how it was done in the past. The past was results-based. That was what it was based on when they brought in when they brought FERPA in the first place. And this sort of shifts that away into a bit more of a local management in a smaller zone. So, but there is I think I mentioned earlier, there's some regulations that are being worked out still. I think some of the pilots, and I'm wondering, what I'm hearing today as this conversation evolves, we're almost talking, we're veering into land use planning and forest landscape planning. Unfortunately, I'm not necessarily the expert on it, but there are people who love to talk about this. I'm almost feeling a separate session coming on where we should engage on this in a bit more detail, hear from the nations who are doing some of the pilot projects that they want to come speak about it, and hear from the Chief Forester's Office, because it sounds like this is actually a point of great interest. I don't know if Ariel Taylor, was she on earlier from the Chief Forester's Office too? She may have spoken a little bit about this, but I'm not entirely sure if that was covered.
Ariel wasn't able to join us.
Okay. That's what I mean by the interest is coming here.
I can jump in and just say a few words. So The forest landscape planning process was first introduced to the BCCFA members back in 2019 at our AGM, and we do have a working group. We talked about this morning. Rachel Pollard and Leith McKenzie joined us this morning, and I think what we agreed was that we do need to do more organized information sessions for our members to explain the changes. Now that the legislation's introduced, ministry staff are free to speak about what's in there. What we know is that the legislation is enabling that it's going to be worked out in regulation. I think another key distinction, Al, just to your question, is that for one, the forest landscape planning framework creates a vehicle, if you will, for government to government shared decision making at the planning stage, and that hasn't really existed before. The plans will be established by the chief forester, as opposed to a forest stewardship plan, which was owned by the licensee. So it's a little bit of a different relationship there, and they'll be spatialized, right? So that's the idea, is to figure out, what the values are of the First Nations, of the local communities, and other stakeholders, and how are we going to manage that on a bigger landscape than we've done. So it could happen at a timber supply area level, certainly for volume-based licenses. And then as we think about community forest, this is a bit of a tricky of figuring out, okay, would a CFA want to be part of that larger forest landscape level plan with adjacent licensees, or do they want to do their own? And that's something that we have to engage with government on and our members on and figure out the options.
Excellent. I think that's probably a good place to wrap things up. And just to stitch things together again, this talk of land use planning and forest management planning, things like that. John Jack's words of becoming what we should have been. That's really a vision that calls for a planning-based approach that says we're not where we are right. We're not where we want to be right now. We should be in a different place. How do we get there? So I think that's for me anyway, something I'll take away from these sessions and the sort of continuity through them. Susie, I wonder if I can pass things back to you to wrap us up.
You can always tell the people who love me, my good friends call me Susie. Thanks so much, Craig and Melissa and the others and the panel, the crew from Quesnel. Yours is a really inspirational story, and I thank you so much for coming and sharing it with us. And John's wisdom, I actually heard him at UBCM, and I emailed him right away and said, will you please come and talk to my people? And I'm so grateful that he was able to. And I think it's, from looking at the chat, I think it was really a meaningful time. I just do want to say that donations are being given on behalf of the speakers to the Lytton First Nations. Their community, as we all know, was heavily impacted by the fires this year, and so it will go to their rebuild fund.